The CNBC app. Global market news in one place. Customizable sections and personalized alerts. Stocks tracking, interactive charts and market insights all in your hands. Stay connected. Stay informed. Download the CNBC app today.
Very warm welcome to Squawk Box Europe. I'm Steve Sedgwick with Karen Cho and Juliana Tattelbaum, and these are your headlines. President Trump threatens more strikes on Venezuela if its acting leader doesn't cooperate after the capture of the President Nicolas Maduro, saying the U.S. is now in charge of the country.
Oil prices edge lower in the first trading day after Maduro's removal. This as President Trump says U.S. companies will spend billions to reverse declining production in Venezuela.
And Trump now turning his attention elsewhere, threatening the leaders of Cuba and Colombia and drawing condemnation from Denmark as he sets his sights on Greenland.
We need Greenland from the standpoint of national security, and Denmark is not going to be able to do it, I can tell you.
Right, it's the first time the three of us have been on set together for a couple of weeks, and Karen's been manning the ship for most of that time. Well done you. But the fact of the matter is the news flow is extraordinary. A very warm welcome to 2026 to everyone who hasn't been watching the show over the holiday period. I apologise if you haven't. You should have done. But the fact of the matter is it's big news. And what I will say right at this moment is actually be very careful on the ramifications you are trying to draw from this for our world, for the world of markets, for the world of business, because at the moment it is a real stretch to say there are immediate ramifications for any of the asset classes we study.
It sets the scene for geopolitics in 2026 just right from the outset. And it was fascinating as we wrapped up the year end, we saw gold prices move into positive territory yet again into that final stretch. And a lot of the brokers are already calling 5,000 on the price. So does it set the scene again for gold prices given the uncertainty? And what does it mean given there's been a little bit of fluctuation already around the foreign exchange movements, and that was obviously a feature out of corporate earnings last year?
I think in terms of market reaction, it's also notable we've seen a move higher in Asian equities, our first glimpse into how equities across the globe may respond. So we'll, of course, be tracking the market reaction throughout the show.
All right, so US President Donald Trump says Washington needs total access to Venezuela, including its oil, in order to rebuild the country after capturing its President Nicolas Maduro. Trump said a second wave of strikes is possible if Caracas doesn't behave. Also warning Venezuela's acting leader, Delcy Rodriguez, that she could pay a very big price if she doesn't do what's right. Speaking on Air Force One, Trump said the U.S. is in charge following the arrest of Maduro.
Have you spoken to the newly sworn-in president there, Rodriguez? And what are your thoughts on the entire situation? You said the U.S. would run Venezuela.
We're dealing with the people. We're dealing with the people that just got sworn in. And don't ask me who's in charge, because I'll give you an answer and it'll be very controversial.
What does that mean?
It means we're in charge.
Trump's reiteration that the U.S. is in charge of Venezuela came after Secretary of State Marco Rubio appeared to shift away from the idea on Sunday. Rubio said the U.S. would use leverage from its oil blockade and regional military buildup to achieve its policy aims in Venezuela. Venezuela's acting President Delcy Rodriguez has asked the U.S. to work with Caracas in an apparent softening of her tone towards the White House. In a statement, Rodriguez invited Washington to work on a cooperation agenda aimed at shared development. Nicolas Maduro is expected to make an appearance in U.S. federal court in New York today, following his capture over the weekend. The deposed Venezuelan leader is facing charges related to drug trafficking and weapons offences alongside his wife, Cecilia Flores.
All right, let me get very editorial on this one. I don't think and I'll challenge our next guest on this one. I'm sure she'll have a very strong view on this one. I don't believe the world needs one extra barrel from Venezuela at the moment. There is a supply glut going on. So the idea that the world needs one drop of extra Venezuelan oil, and my goodness me, their exports have dropped precipitously because of utter corruption and incompetence and lack of investment over the last few years as well. But just an issue there which we'll raise in a moment. So crude prices edging lower in what has been a volatile trading session as traders digest the implications of Maduro's capture. Venezuela boasts the proven largest proven crude oil reserves globally at around 303 billion barrels, which is really annoying because it was always a great quiz question that I loved saying to non-oil people, but now everyone knows. With the country producing around 800,000 barrels per day. Trump said the US is going to take back, which is interesting, take back Venezuelan oil.
We want safety there. We want to be surrounded by countries that aren't housing all of our enemies all over the world. That's what that was happening, and you don't want to have that. But we're going to be rebuilding, and we're not spending money. The oil companies are going to go in. They're going to spend money. We're going to take back the oil that, frankly, we should have taken back a long time ago.
Amrita Sen is founder and director of market intelligence at Energy Aspects. Amrita, there are 1,000 angles on this as well, but let's go back to real basics as well. Let's start with that Trump comment. Trump says we're going to take it back. It was never US oil to begin with, but there was a lot of heavy US influence in the Venezuelan oil industry, wasn't there?
And that Venezuela actually owes the US a lot of money, and that's kind of where the comments are coming from.
They owe Conoco,
exactly, Chevron, etc.
So in terms of why the US would want to take back or take over the Venezuelan oil industry, which would be an extraordinary endeavour, especially an extraordinary endeavour in normal times, let alone at a time when the world is facing a supply glut as well. Do you want to just talk us through your ideas on this one?
Yeah, and I actually don't disagree with what you said. I don't think the world requires Venezuelan oil right now. There is ample supply with the OPEC unwind that started last year. We are looking at potentially one of the biggest oversupplies in 2026, over 2 million barrels per day. Now, having said that, lots of factors are going against it already, especially with a lot of Russian oil that's unsold. Kazakhstan's oil is still offline, at least half of it. So there are factors that would suggest that we're not going to get as big an oversupply as a lot of people are fearing. It's still going to be a surplus. But having said that, Venezuela's oil, yes, it's very difficult to process, but it is heavy crude oil, which refineries like, particularly in the US Gulf Coast.
But it needs feedstocks, lighter types of oil to in order to process it, because as you say, it's very heavy oil and needs to be turned around, and it takes a very complex processing. So who would provide those feedstocks? Is that the point here?
Well, part of it would come from the US. Right now, it's Iran and Russia that provide the feedstock. So it's far more complicated, I would say. But one thing we haven't talked about, you said that the industry, the upstream industry in Venezuela has been completely destroyed. We've done some analysis. Some of the experts we have in our upstream team are actually from Venezuela themselves. Takes just to raise production by 500,000 barrels per day would be about $10 billion and would take 2 years. Anything which, going back to what they used to be the peak, 2.5 million barrels per day, closer to $100 billion, anywhere between 7 to 10 years.
Trump was talking about the billions that the US oil companies could spend in Venezuela. What would be the backdrop for those American companies, international oil companies, wanting to invest again in Venezuela? What exactly would it take?
I think that's the critical thing. Right now, traders are reacting to there could be a lot of oil. Firstly, to Steve's point, we don't need it right now. But longer term, yes, we will require more oil as, potentially there is a supply crunch coming, but that's kind of the long-term story. The issue is the infrastructure is so dilapidated. Like gas processing, without gas processing, you can't even think about increasing oil production. There is no gas processing capacity left. We haven't even talked about the billions of dollars of debt that Venezuela owes, including, guess who, to China, still over $10 billion. And most of this Venezuelan oil actually does go to China. So is a company just going to go in there, assuming that, firstly, the new contracts will be actually agreed to by any new Venezuelan government in the future? And then where on the pecking order are they in terms of the debt payments?
It's incredibly complex, isn't it?
Yes.
And what happened previously in Venezuela in terms of the nationalization of oil interests, conflicts over existing contracts layered on top of today's world, and whether a transition government can lead to some sort of peaceful and potentially, would you say, democratic backdrop eventually? Would that be necessary to have democracy play out? Because that's not exactly what Trump is talking about as he's suggesting installing the vice president potentially, who is part of really the existing regime.
And for me, that's the most interesting thing, that what has changed so far? Yes, we have taken Maduro out of the equation, but the exact Chavismo is still in power. Sure, some of the kind of comments coming out that they might be working better with the US to come up with some sort of solution, but fundamentally nothing's changed on the political landscape. Also, the blockade remains in place. Venezuelan exports have already more than halved just in the last few weeks.
And Marita, for markets this morning, it feels like the debate is really around the potential short-term disruption versus the long-term impact of a potential boost in oil output from Venezuela. When you put those two, driving forces together, what does it mean for the oil price?
I do think the back end of the curve probably feels more pressure because we're talking to all the traders over the weekend, really asking us about what's that 2 to 5 year outlook. I do think there is no 2 to 5 year outlook. I mean, 2 years, sure, they can get 500,000 barrels per day. That's not the game changer. It's really much more longer term. But again, to you guys' point, there needs to be stability first. There needs to be clarity first, in terms of so many things with regards to the political backdrop, but also the debt and the infrastructure. Who's going to pay for this infrastructure build-out, by the way?
And in terms of paying for the infrastructure build-out, what's your take?
I cannot see, and even US companies, if you've seen of course, they'll be interested in going back, but nobody's really jumping on this simply because it is a really big undertaking. Every single layer of it, right? Because you have to rebuild from scratch. Also, let alone the fact that so many personnel have left. They have a massive brain drain as well.
Just on, I have a view that this is typical Trump. And look, there's a million aspects. This is my editorial opinion. It's typical Trump. The world is now looking at Trump and Venezuela and his foreign policy and what it means for Cuba, what it means for Colombia, what it means for Mexico, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
And you mentioned China and Iran and Russia as well. It's got so many angles, and we wouldn't get through them all in a 10-hour show. But I can't help thinking Trump is getting everyone to look over here when actually what he wants to do is get people to, it's not look over here. And what he doesn't want people to look at is the domestic situation in the United States, the domestic inflation picture, the economic picture, and the fact that actually he is behind in the polls, or potentially for the midterms coming forward as well. I can't see at all how this plays out well with his base. There's already been some MAGA advocates who have said this is not an America First policy. This is an adventurist policy, which we do not want to see America in as well. I don't see how this affects the American economy, and that's what I think is the key point. Everyone's looking at the US foreign policy. I think we should be looking at the US economy for why Trump is doing this as well. Can you see any reason, and you look at things from a macro point of view, how this will change the backdrop to the US economy?
No, I do not actually see any near-term impact.
Not going to change the price of gasoline, which is now $2.83.
To what, $1? Because suddenly there'll be like 20,000.
Which will be a disaster for Exxon, Chevron, and Conoco. Yeah,
of course. But also, how much new oil? If the blockade's still in place and sanctions are still in place, there is no new Venezuelan oil coming to the market, right? Short term, I think there's more downside than upside risk. And like we just discussed, it's going to take years and hundreds of billions of dollars to actually get this to turn around. That's probably why, though, he's spinning this as we're going to get the oil back, right? So that he can claim that, okay, look, we're going to get oil prices down.
The point you make is a fascinating one about the optics here and whether this is a gigantic distraction technique. But you could also say the same around foreign policy, because Trump was getting mired in a lot of different issues globally. Is this a distraction technique around foreign policy specifically because it's designed to put other world leaders on edge, where he's been struggling to solve the war in Ukraine? If there was any movement here, and are there ramifications when it comes to that situation? What about when it comes to Iran as well?
Yeah.
Could you have a situation that moves forward from here? Very tactical operation in Venezuela could be different if there was a further move by the Americans when it comes to Iran, trying to solve what's been a very difficult country to interact with for the Americans. How do you think about the broader consequences of what's transpired in Venezuela impacting other oil-heavy nations?
I think what he is doing in Venezuela is definitely going to be heard and seen very clearly in Iran, in Russia as well, right? In terms of whether you think or say that, look, you need to take him seriously, or that don't dismiss it when he says, oh, I am going to be doing X, right? I think that's definitely something world leaders will be very careful about. But to your point, especially around Russia, Ukraine, that has gone nowhere, right? And if anything, the sanctions, I know there's a lot of oversupply right now, we don't talk about it. We are hearing from different sources about 80 to 85 million barrels of Russian oil unsold, floating around.
How many?
80 to 85 million barrels.
Wow.
Yes, and this is not being reported in the media because, again, it's hard to kind of capture exactly how much since really November. So there are these things that are brewing. And if, by the way, if suddenly you take that oil out of the market's not as oversupplied in 2026, right? And then gasoline prices are not going to be $1. It might even be $3.50.
Amrita, well, just to take that part of the conversation a little bit further, over the weekend, OPEC Plus decided to keep output steady. No weighing in on the political developments. Obviously, it's a fast-moving target here, but over the coming weeks, how do you expect OPEC Plus to weigh in and potentially respond?
I don't think they ever really get involved in the politics, right? We've had different OPEC nations even at war with each other in the past, and OPEC as a institution has survived all of that. And I think policy has been, and it was a less than 10-minute meeting again, policy has been keep production steady for Q1. Don't see that changing. They want to see what happens through Q1. It's the weakest period for oil demand anyways. And then they'll reassess, again, Feb, March, they have meetings. And again, they take the long view, right? They know this Venezuela situation is super fluid every day. Between Rubio and Trump, you hear different things within hours, right? So nobody really knows what's going on either.
Yeah, it's so fascinating, especially for considering. I mean, it really makes me feel. And I'm sorry for our viewers who don't remember me and Amrita at OPEC in those days. But do you remember Rafael Ramirez?
Yes.
He was the longest-serving Chavez minister, and we used to chat to him all the time. And he was an amazing person to speak to. He was the energy minister of Venezuela, and all of these issues. We've been talking about them all century. It's extraordinary.
But also, what we talked about is there's been so many headlines, and to your point, everyone's talking about it. Fundamentally, if you take a step back, what has actually changed other than we've just taken Maduro out of the equation?
And I don't mean to mention someone else, but I'll do this because you know that you love the man as much as I do. Dan Yergin. When I asked him in ADIPEC a couple of years ago, I said, what's the key issue? Is it Saudi? Is it Iran? He goes, Venezuela. Do you remember Dan always used to say, and so the man's always proved right. He's just a legend. He's just a legend. You're a legend.
Happy
New Year.
Happy New
Lovely
Year.
to see you. We'll
Likewise.
see masses of you in 2026, I hope.
Hope so.
Thank you for coming in. I appreciate that. Amrita Sen, founder and director of market intelligence at Energy Aspects. And for more on what Maduro's arrest means for energy markets and who's in control of Venezuela's vast oil reserves, head online to CNBC.com.
And don't miss our conversation with the former ambassador of Venezuela to the United Kingdom, Vanessa Newman. That is coming up at 9:30 London time.
Well, following the U.S. operation to capture Nicolas Maduro, Trump said Cuba looks like it's ready to fall and appeared to threaten the president of Colombia. The U.S. president also repeated his desire to control Greenland.
We need Greenland from a national security situation. It's so strategic. Right now, Greenland is covered with Russian and Chinese ships all over the place. We need Greenland from the standpoint of national security. And Denmark is not going to be able to do it, I can tell you.
Danish Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen has urged Washington to stop the threats around taking over Greenland, saying the U.S. has no right to annex any of the three nations in the Danish kingdom. Coming up on the show, the capture of Venezuela's President Nicolas Maduro draws sharp condemnation, including from China. We'll bring you Beijing's response next. Plus, we'll look ahead to this week's non-farm payrolls print as traders look for clues on the health of the U.S. economy. And we'll chat to Jerry Keefe, head of banking for Europe and the Americas at HSBC. That's at 9:15 London time.
Executive Decisions is the new podcast from CNBC, where I ask powerful leaders about their decisions that changed everything. I'm Steve Sedgwick. Here's Miss Jo Malone, CBE.
I started that first business of skincare. That's when I knew that I was in charge of my own life. And that's when the entrepreneur really, although I didn't know what the word entrepreneur meant, that's when the entrepreneur really took hold.
That's Executive Decisions with me, Steve Sedgwick. Get it wherever you're listening to this.
More reaction to the situation in Venezuela this morning. The China Foreign Ministry with comments out saying China expressed a grave concern over US seizing Maduro and his wife, saying the situation that the action violates international law. Also that China calls on US to immediately release Maduro and goes on to say China's closely following the security situation there. It's received no report of Chinese personnel affected by U.S. strike there, and China always maintaining positive communication, cooperation with Venezuelan government. It has made plenty of comments actually this morning, and it still goes on to say China respects the sovereignty, independence of Venezuela, and believes that Venezuelan government will probably be able to handle the internal affairs on the basis of the constitution and law, that Chinese interest in Venezuela will also be protected by law, and that the U.S. use of force threatens peace in Latin America, that all parties should promote resuming stability, restoring order. Let's get out to Elaine for more out of Hong Kong. Elaine, we've got the China Foreign Ministry commenting on the situation in Venezuela, but I know internationally everybody's looking at what the consequences could be for Taiwan and how China now treats Taiwan, and whether there could be any change to the stability we've seen so far.
Yeah, that's a question that has been on a lot of people's minds, and some people, say that if the U.S. can unilaterally act like that, then what will China do in regards to questions related to Taiwan or the South China Sea? And some analysts I've spoken to, though, say that China will mostly use this capture to frame the U.S. as sort of acting like a rogue state, acting outside the norms of international relations. And if it ever ramps up its claims in, say, the South China Sea, it could point to U.S. action. And if the U.S. accuses China of breaking laws, then the U.S. could also face pushback from China. And as we see, China's reacted very strongly over the weekend as well. A sharply worded Xinhua commentary from China's official news agency said that the U.S. incursion hollows out decades of U.S. rhetoric positioning the U.S. as the guardian of international rules. It wrote, even said that Washington now is one of the most serious threats to the very international order it claims to defend. Now, I was speaking with several analysts as well about the Taiwan question, and they say Beijing views this more as an internal domestic matter. It doesn't feel like it needs to seek permission from the international community, or it's not acting on Taiwan out of deference from the international law. And of course, in the last week of last year as well, we saw Beijing simulating a blockade of the democratically governed island. But people I've been speaking with say that it's unlikely that Beijing will dramatically recalculate how it's going to approach Taiwan. It's not so much going to move its needle there. So it's not really sort of the same comparison, but no doubt a lot of people are watching for some parallels there. Karen.
Elaine, I will pick up. Certainly does seem like people are looking out for parallels there. Really appreciate the recap. Now, in terms of market reaction, I mentioned this at the start of the show. We are seeing strong gains in many of the Asian markets. Nikkei 225 up almost 3%. We were up more than 3% a little while ago. You're also seeing gains in the Shanghai Composite in mainland China. That index up about 1.4%. The Hang Seng trading just a touch below the flat line, and not a huge amount of movement over in Australia. In terms of European futures, here's your early look. Right now we are looking at modest gains here. This follows modest gains on Friday as well for the main benchmark Stoxx 600. In terms of Bitcoin, interestingly, in early Asian trading, we've seen Bitcoin hit a 3-week high. Right now we're up about 1.4%. Many, of course, at the end of last year tracking the relationship between Bitcoin and equities. It will be interesting to see how Bitcoin fares in an environment of escalated geopolitical risk. Finally, in terms of U.S. futures, here's your early look at the Wall Street Open. We are right now looking at modest gains there as well. Not a huge market reaction. And Steve, to your point, markets at this point don't seem to really be doing much on the back of these Venezuelan developments.
And that is the right reaction. I mean, what would they be doing? What asset would you be buying or selling? I mean, the only asset which is obviously moving higher is gold, and that's the same trade that we've been seeing for most of last year.
Absolutely. I think the consequences are hard to ascertain beyond today. Very difficult to know just how long the shadow of what happened has some sort of lasting implication. I mean, the US was very reluctant to go into a lot of countries and to cause regime change after what they saw in the Middle East over the years. Now we're talking about potential nation building. How quickly could any sort of peaceful transition be established here in Venezuela? Is it as tactical, is it as swift as it looks right now, or could there be longer consequences than the market can ascertain? What does it mean for domestic policy, as you pointed out, coming up to the midterms for the economy domestically? If there are oil consequences, oil price consequences, and what does it mean in terms of the international environment? Does it embolden other dictators in terms of wanting to expand their own sovereign states, or does it actually deter them from here because of the strong arm tactics of Trump when it comes to foreign policy? So I think the talking points for 2026 are enormous on the back of this, and the consequences could be significant. We just can't tell what they're going to be today.
I think that's certainly a good point, that if we do see leaders around the world emboldened by these actions, likes of China, and to Elaine's point, there's a lot of temptation right now to draw parallels and consider whether President Xi feels emboldened to take action on Taiwan now as a result of this. And that, of course, would be or could be a potentially astronomical event for markets.
If not tomorrow, if not under the Trump regime, but down the track potentially as well, as we think about China having a long-term lens.
Yeah, all of the above. I would just draw attention to the fact that apparently this is about drug trafficking and a cartel being run to export cocaine from various Latin American countries via kind of some umbrella protection from the Venezuelan government as well into the United States. So if that is the case, and let's take the Trump administration at its word on this one as well, then I would be more concerned about what it means for Mexico, what it means for Colombia, and that entire region. Because if this is about cocaine, which a lot of people have been very skeptical about, thinking it's actually about the oil and about the economic sphere of influence, and a redux of Monroe Doctrine, which everyone's fiercely Googling now as well, I think that would be quite fascinating.
We're going to take a quick break. Here's a look at European futures. As we head off, we'll be back in just a couple of minutes. We are looking at green across the board.